Summit. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about the journey to the cloud. Maybe it's a pretentious title here, right? Starts here. But the idea is to convey a certain number of models and methodologies that are actually the foundational steps when we try to design, architect, move our infrastructure or our customers' infrastructure into the Azure environment, including people, processes, and some structures there. As Marco mentioned, I'm an old man that yells at cloud. I have known Azure since it was called the Red Dog. I showed him earlier. I'm going to show it again. This is one of the oldest Microsoft Azure t-shirts, which actually says Windows Azure. My Windows Azure never slips. And I wear it only on special occasions. That's why it's in mint condition. Yeah, originally Microsoft Azure was called Windows Azure, but that, I guess, freaked out the open source community. Been around for a while. I used to work for Ingram Micro, spent 11 years at Microsoft. I actually collaborated with different, let's say, runs different student as well as portions of the MVP program when it was introduced. In 2005, actually, we had our first MVP here in SQL. A couple of contact links. So I'm active on Twitter, LinkedIn, other environments as well. This is my community address because I'm one of the co-founders of the Macedonian IT Pro community group. We run regular sessions always. I keep Marco informed, and hopefully he shares the information with you guys. And yeah, this is a kind of an open discussion. I want to run it. Within 40 minutes, I'll try to explain certain aspects of the cloud adoption framework as a kind of a foundational model how you can actually start the journey. Now, as far as the architecture design, right? The soft skills side combined with technical, a must-read set of kind of documents I would emphasize here, which are, well, focus here is the cloud adoption framework as a kind of a foundational document for that operation. But we also have the Azure well-architected framework, which tackles areas like reliability, security, cost optimization, operational excellence, and performance efficiency. Now, this not only gives you a kind of framework approach, but also gives you best practices. So for architects, designers of solutions based on Azure, this is also a must-read document. It conveys the actual practical knowledge that Microsoft engineers have, and it's conveyed in this framework. We have also the Azure reference architectures, which is a list that continually expands and gives you a kind of architectural conceptual model, as well as supporting documentation, links, information, script code samples, and any relevant information in regards to design a specific solution. We have the design patterns, which come to think of it in the architecture center. When they were initially introduced, it had 8 patterns there. Now there are more than 30. Right, remember, we move from on-premises, in some cases, very static compared to the cloud, of course, environment, which actually is asynchronous and distributed environment, right? So there are different things we need to consider from a development standpoint, what we can actually do in regards to mapping the functionalities of an on-premises process or service and how it will be transposed in the cloud. Last but not least, it's the Azure subscription limits and quotas, which is an important thing, especially when you think of enterprise and a large number of entities inside and services that can be run. I'll throw in some samples within the kind of a theoretical side based on the experience I had working with different groups of people, virtual teams, customers, partners, things like that. Now, the cloud adoption framework, which will be the focus of our session, this 40 minutes, 45 minutes, it's actually going from the starting point, right? What do we want to build? Right? Is it a house? Is it a stadium? Is it a bridge? Now, yeah, they're all architectural things, right? We need to design them. There is a lot of math inside involved from that standpoint, but then, right, one size does not fit all. Right, it will be a house, which means limited number of users. If I use the analogy here, right, some small to mid-sized environment where certain operations will be handled by the environment. But if I want to put more than the capacity of the actual house in regards to people, services, capabilities, then probably it will be too small for us, right? And right, stadium-wise, it is a thing that, yeah, if we think of stadiums, we use them based on a event, right? But then we have a large number of users accessing the same event at the same time, and then everybody's gone, right? And last but not least, bridge, right? It might not be as glorious as, I don't know, Golden Gate or some other samples of, I don't know, it can be over a river, it can be over connecting two shores to a narrow sea pass or in the mountains. But then again, it has a frequent type of communication inside, which actually will influence what's the capacity, what's the size, and what's the other components that we need to consider, right? The overall model of the cloud adoption framework starts with, yeah, we can design an enterprise solution, but we can also start small, which means we have the foundational grounds, what we're going to build, and how we want to expand, right? And this is all part of the planning process, right? Even before planning, right? I'm not talking about technology side. I'm talking about the business side. Why do I want to do this? Why do I need the house? Why do I need the stadium? Why do I need the Azure environment? Do I need to run it in a single data center region? Do I need to span across Europe? Do I need to span across the world, right? Which also boils down to the concept that we need to identify what workloads are we talking about. Now, by workload, I mean any form of application or service, or let's say a business process of some kind covered by that on-premises technology that we have. Right? It can be a server, it can be the quantity of memory in the server, the storage space, the network connectivity, the interconnectivity between different endpoints, whether they're servers, appliances, whatever they are in the data center. And then how I can move them further and how I can move them to the cloud. In most cases, we speak about hybrid environments, right? There is something on premises in the data center, there is something in the cloud. Now, it may be a full shift from on premises to the cloud, but it can be a coexistence model. And most of the organizations, especially the enterprise ones, the big ones, consider the hybrid model, right? And there is a plan how we're going to get to the cloud side. Small, mid-sized organizations, startups, for example, they're cloud-born, cloud-ready in most cases, especially startup organizations, right? They do not invest anything in on-premises. They just use the benefits of the cloud and the capability that it gives them, right? So we usually start, whenever we talk about moving to the cloud, right? We identify the workload. It might look like a small thing, but it can be actually multiple applications and multiple components that support those applications. A database, a caching, a content delivery model, a proxy service of some kind, anything inside, right? So in decentralized operations, we place the workload in the cloud. Now, usually when that happens, people look at the well-architected framework, to be frank, right? Yeah, it explains a lot around certain processes, gives you the best practices, and gives us, in a way, the notion that, yeah, we can move to the cloud. Fairly seamless, fairly fast, but it requires planning, let's face it. Most of the time we'll spend on planning before we start delivering or preparing something. Even if you're talking about an agile organization, doesn't matter. It takes time to get somewhere. In a kind of a more central operation, which is the thing where we usually aim, especially in a larger organization, refer this enterprise customer, right? We create the platform foundations based on which we're going to build the so-called landing zones, and I'll explain what it means as short as possible within the time frame, although we might spend a couple of days only on landing zones concept. Gets more technical there. And then we start putting up workloads inside. Right. The idea is always start small and then expand, because it's not expected that we move completely everything we have inside as a workload to the cloud. Even when we select, and we're going to talk about the rationalization model of the digital estate, or what workloads I can identify to be moved, we start with the one that has less security and compliance requirements, something easy. If I may use the word easy today, these days in IT, right? Something that can be moved, it won't cause a lot of ripple in the organization as far as the functionality, the legislation, the governance, the security model, the operations, but it will give us the necessary skills to understand the concepts and how we can move further, how we can expand in the future. Now, once we start expanding on a larger environment, means that we're going to centralize certain, not only IT operations, but also governance, and our adoption strategies will evolve. And then we think about enterprise landing zones. And I'll just show you how a high-level diagram of an enterprise landing zone goes, just for you to know. And most of this information also will be shared with links at the end. And then and these are just the maturity levels we can achieve. So as we progress and adopt more and more of the cloud technologies and capabilities, we move towards the so-called distributed operations, right? It's a global operations, something that handles a worldwide type of operations for our organization, which means very complex operational models, a significant number and combinations of different capabilities inside, right? In regards to locations where we deploy our workloads, what's the availability and scalability requirements, security governance models, right? And then multiple teams that work on different aspects of the technology, which means more complex cloud adoption planning, and then the whole 360 lifecycle evolving that process, right? Now, as the environmental complexity of the on-premises environment and the workloads there are more complex, then we need a more complex organization. Now, we will never have enough people, time, and money to complete everything, most probably. So we need to choose carefully, and then we have to have some look at things and how we can actually approach the whole process. And one of the things which is actually very dear to my heart, and I use it a lot in my, let's say, day-to-day operations as a consultant and trainer, is the cloud adoption framework. Now, this is a high-level representation of what cloud adoption framework represents. Now, we're still talking about significant number of pages we can visit inside Microsoft documentation that will give us a kind of in-depth knowledge about this one. Now, it will take time, of course, but then we start small and we expand, right? Now, it starts with the definition of strategy, right? As mentioned at the beginning, is it house? Is it a stadium? Is it a building? Is it a bridge? Is it a highway? Whatever it is, right? We have to start from somewhere. What's the motivation? Why are we going to do this, right? And most of these questions are addressed from the business side. Right? The idea is that the business, supported by the technology and processes involved in that technology, meaning the people that support those processes as well, will drive this as a motivating factor. And I'm going to show you just a sample of what potential motivation factors would be. And then now this is the place where we decide we're going to go left or right. What's the amount of money to spend? What are the initial investments? What are the return on investments? What is the total cost of ownership? Things like that, right? Now, it doesn't mean that necessarily you will get there. I had a chance these days to listen to quite a few of presentations from a technical standpoint. Very impressive, I must say. But yeah, there is a place for everybody in this structure. Maybe not immediately, maybe after a few years, but you will get somewhere within this model as a professional speaking, right? Then we have the planning phase. Now, the planning phase encompasses operations like doing an inventory of what digital estate we have, right? What are the services or the workloads I can identify inside, how they're interconnected, what they mean for my organizational security governance and compliance management process, right? And make a kind of a decision model. Well, can I move it to the cloud, or maybe in the future, or never? And how I can move it. Now, this planning also has a huge influence on the organizational alignment, meaning what does my old job and what I did before the cloud adoption process, and what does the cloud adoption bring me? Now, I've seen major failures in this area. For example, I worked with a very large organization for a couple of years doing training and some architecture design work. They never started the initial organizational alignment. Their IT support personnel was still bound to, or their operations in general personnel was still bound to the monolithic model they had on the application services or the workloads running on-prem. And they had very monolithic environments. Now, they tried to move them in monolithic SS into the Azure. Doesn't work, right? This distributed asynchronous model. They had a very silo-based model on-prem. Now, that caused an issue. So they invested a lot on skill readiness, on digital estate mapping, then readiness, and then adoption for the migration and innovation process. But their organization was never adapted to move to the cloud. They still run things as their in-house, as their on-premises, where they control the data center facilities, the keys, the access to the environment, the procurement of hardware, everything there. That's software-defined everything over there in Azure. We don't have control on that one, which caused major blockage and kind of revert back in certain processes. Now, anything that comes as a cloud adoption plan will come from this phase, actually. Now, the next step will be the readiness phase, where we prepare the environment, where we start tackling, well, actually first deployment of our landing zone there, and how do we expand, right? And this is the lesson learned also model. Whatever we learn in this phase will go back either in planning, so we stop, step back, start planning again, right? We can do sprints if you like on that one, and DevOps actually is a part of the whole process, right? Agility there, but we need to move fast enough so that we understand what we're doing, we reinforce the learning process inside, and we still manage to cover the standardized training for our people. You need to know what Azure services are. I mean, let's face it, there are almost 200 different types of services inside. And the list of the resources I specified earlier, it's not always enough, right? Yeah, each one of you will have their specific role in the organization. Let's assume you're everybody in the same organization and you have a specific role, and then you need to collaborate and cooperate between each other, right? So sharing information, sharing knowledge, proper information is important in those cases. Now, the adoption phase, it's actually bound to whether I'm going to do a migration or a full re-architecture, re-platforming of my solution and innovate something, as they refer it here, to be more cloud aware and cloud ready, right? So it's more like a cloud native environment. The migrate option is most common because we think of hybrid, right? Co-location of services, something it's in the cloud, something is on-prem, so we need to consider how we connect them, how we exchange data. Can be different reasons for that. Now, this is the kind of the technical side, right? The other side of the model, which gives us the 360 view on the environment and the cloud adoption processes, is the security, governance, and management. Right. And again, there is a specific methodology for security and what we're looking for and what it brings us, right? The automation and machine learning, artificial intelligence capabilities of the cloud platform actually give us a little bit more we can do in regards to processes and activities compared to what we do by ourselves in our organization, right? Or in a manual, semi-manual process. The governance model, they can be a tricky set of people, including the security. They need to be onboarded. So yeah, most of these things in the planning, we'll also talk with security, with governance people, and then we need to prep the operations side, the management, right? Once we move to the cloud, the operations team, we need to be ready. They need to handle the new ways based on the adoption principles, right? What's going on, what are the services? So they need to go through proper skills upgrades. The operational procedures needs to be upgraded. People need to know what to expect. Tier 1, Tier 2 support, right? Eventually, vendor and third-party support processes need to be amended if necessary. Remember, especially with the management, the service level agreements that the cloud provider gives us, they're not our service level agreements. If I need to redeliver that SLA, and I apologize for the acronyms, if you get confused, then ping me, I'll explain. I used to be in Microsoft, so a lot of acronyms in my mind. Means that, right, if I need to call Microsoft support, there will be a delay. So the SLA for the Microsoft service, it's not my SLA as tier 1 support towards my internal employee or the customer, whoever it is on the other side. So there is a delay. So this needs to be adjusted accordingly. Now, let me drill down in some of the other aspects, right, of the process. So if you look at
you have two questions.
Sure.
The one isn't the cloud a must for this kind of work? And what's the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 support?
Okay, good questions. If you're talking about, can you clarify what context you're talking about in regards to the cloud?
About the first question, yeah.
Yeah, about the first question. What kind of work do you refer to, Slaven? If you can be more specific. So you can write it down nowhere. So tier 1, tier 2 means in regards to who gets the support request first. So if the tier 1 support cannot solve it, it will move to tier 2, right? Which can be tier 1 can be more generalist, right? So they mainly resolve basic operations that can be resolved by just viewing the status of the services, for example, and then responding based on a specific pattern. If a specific service interaction or reconfiguration or analysis needs to be done, then it moves to the next step where a set of subject matter experts will be on that tier, and then might expand towards the third-party provider, in this case, Microsoft support engineers, for example. Okay, in regards to whether I'm gonna move a certain service to the cloud or not, well, it can be ruled by specific governance or regulatory requirements. For example, for certain reasons or internal policy, there is a law against it, for example, for some kind, or there is a regulation that prevents certain portions of data to be moved to the cloud, for example. Now, again, cloud providers support that move, but might be an internal decision. We need to have all the data that's stored in the database services on premises. So I can expose the front-end services and the middle tier services on the cloud, but then anything that's exchanged in a form of data through a secure channel has to end up in my on-premises database, for example. I've seen scenarios like that. Three-tier architecture, so front-end, middle tier of some kind, or some processing tier or proxy tier, and then I have the data layer, which is the database. The database was on premises. Yeah, it's company policy. It can be regulated environments. So regulated environments, telco, finance sector, government, public safety, defense, right? Things like that. They have certain requirements for certain things, right? The operational requirements of the organizations. And yes, they can still benefit the cloud, even with those company policies, but in some cases, they don't want to change them for some reason. It's a long internal process, especially it's a paper-based, trust me. Yeah, sure, of course, that's what I'm here for, to make things clear. I mean, maybe it's too early in your state since you're in the university, but you'll get the hang of it once you find yourself in a situation like that. You might remember, yeah, there was one guy that spoke about cloud adoption framework and mentioned these things. So this is my one of the biggest takeaways, if not for the session. Now, as far as the motivation, right, business, there's a lot we can discuss here. A lot of buzzwords can be found and can be addressed as part of the overall process here. But there is always a trigger, right? It can be, oh no, my data center hardware is too old. So should I buy a new one, or should I invest in operational costs like cloud and then move certain workloads there? It can be overwhelmed usage of the service. So they publish a new service, they were expecting certain utilization to happen, but suddenly a lot more people are using it, which means we need to procure additional hardware components and etc., etc. So one of the easier steps would be to move to the cloud in portions of the service, so you can accommodate the large intake of users, right? It can be increasing the automation and introduction of new tools in regards to automation and some intelligence embedded in the platform that the cloud, in this case Azure, provides, and in comparison what we need to do on premises. Right. So there are kind of, I know, 10, 15 different standardized reasons you can pull from the cloud adoption framework, and this is for the businesses, right? This is the business talk, because based on these triggering mechanisms for the business, they will need to see what are the business outcomes and why they should justify the investment in skills, in people, in services, right, to move that specific workload to the cloud or start thinking of moving workloads to the cloud. Now, again, the IT side of the coin, usually it's not very prepared to talk with the business people, so they're kind of a man in the middle type of roles that can actually handle the business. For example, luckily for me, I went through a lot of pre-sales and sales trainings in Microsoft, so they brought me up to speed how I can talk to business people. So yeah, maybe it comes naturally to me sometimes, but this is something based on learning and experience, which was acquired as a skill, of course, and that would happen to you, of course. Now, some might be relevant, some might not be relevant. Now, if you think about our local market, then probably we'll need to get a little bit creative, which practically I did that during all my Microsoft life cycle of 11 years. I was creative, right? The things that are mentioned here does not reflect always what a local business wants to hear, even if it's an enterprise business like a bank, like the government, like telcos, things like that. So we need to adapt here, right? Now, I have a strong IT pro side, although I started with C++ and open source, but I ended up on the dark side, as they say, in Microsoft ways. But yeah, I have a very strong technical background, and I still root for the IT ops people more than the business side, but it's a synergy at the end of the day. Now, once we decide and they say, give us the go ahead, well, yeah, nice plan, let's move. The next would be, what do we do? Right, we initiate the planning process. Now, what do we have as a workload? So we need to create a form of inventory. Now, the inventory applies to everything that's application type, software of some kind component, local, internal, internally developed or third party, hardware component inside, any form of an operating system on top of which these services and components are run, and any form of system performance metrics we can collect, which for an infrastructure workloads on premises, we should have something at least. Now, there are also corresponding tools like, I don't know, Azure Migrate or third-party tool you can use to analyze your infrastructure. The longer you get the information, the most precise system performance you'll get. So a month, 3 months, 6, a year, right? It can be a longer planning period. But those performance things you can identify. So you can identify which are the peak times, which are the off-peak times, and how it will map to the resources in the cloud. And you can build your, okay, these are the services I need, this would be the potential, the cost structure, so you can start building up the budget and everything regarding that. The problem would be the time, right? I can create inventory of everything and it will take me a very long time. Sample. Guys with the monolithic applications, they had almost 200 applications inside. They were running 5 different environments. Dev, test, staging. They had a kind of a staging before production, and then was the production, the 5th one. Now, create an inventory on that one. 200 different applications. The problem would be you will never have enough people to do the inventory, because you need to talk with the technical people, but also with the business people, because the business people own the service, own the workload, because it brings them some value on the other side. We in the IT operations are the enablers. We give them the tools and the capabilities so they can run the service and make money at the end of the day for the company. So we'll get paid, right? All the costs covered, and then we get all the rewards for the as employees, right? Now, there are 2 types of models we can use. The traditional one, which is the long one, and we need to consider on an enterprise scale as a kind of a midterm process, right? It might take a year or so, sometimes longer, depending on the complexity. And we need to do quantitative and the so-called quality analysis on the inventory, right? We need to limit ourselves to a subset of workloads. We don't look at the 200 applications at the same time. We look at certain of them, number of them, right? Based on that, we create a kind of a quality analysis and reduce the number of contact points outside of the IT that we need to speak with, so we can get the proper information about the process, and then after a while start mapping how that would look to the cloud, right? Now, it is an iterative process, right? We move certain number of steps, we get the information for certain things, we do approximations, which is actually the incremental. It's faster. It reduces the data discovery points, right? The number of people we need to talk. We do assumptions. We try to streamline as much as possible our decision, and the assumptions are of a temporary nature. Once we see that one of the assumptions is not correct, we need to go back, right? Rethink the process a little bit, right? As far as the assumption goes, One of the things to consider is also retiring of certain resources. Why should I move that workload to the cloud if retiring it would be the most appropriate way, because I can amend it with different service or completely replace it with something else, right? Hence, there is a lot of thing going on, right, in this phase. As far as the selection of the first workload, right, we have the business, technical, the qualitative, and the cost model alignment criteria. Now, as simple as it, so the proper term that it's used, let's say in English, is low-hanging fruits. Something I can pick it up without any effort and consume it. In this case, what I can pick up and move it to the cloud as simple as possible without interrupting any other process inside my organization. Not only from an organizational alignment and skills and planning and readiness and adoption process, but also from a security governance compliance model. We need to learn, right? We need to figure out whether this incremental rationalization model for our assets or the workloads works. What we can learn from that. Now, once we start picking up the workloads, we need to decide what we're going to do with them. Right? The simple process, what Microsoft calls rehosting, or as they want to refer to it, is lift and shift. If you heard it, it's written here. I like move and improve. I think it was used first time from one of my Scottish MVPs there, Greg Sutty. I pick up the workload and move it to the cloud to improve its operations, whether it's people operations, service operations, whatever it's there, some operations. So move and improve kind of sticks for me. Microsoft likes kind of a strict naming convention here, but I prefer move and improve. And this is the least effort model. Any physical or virtual machine in an infrastructure service, I can, let's say, I mean, I don't want to use the term easy, but I can move it to the cloud, right? And that's the lift and shift. I can do a very specific analysis, right? Use the incremental rationalization model very fast, use tools to assess the environment, and a minimal change to the architecture occurs. Right? The only thing that will change is eventually how the users communicate, but that from a IT operations side, it's on our side. The user just points, clicks, or goes to the web service or the web URL and then accesses the service. What we need to do to enable that, that's a different story, right? Expected business outcomes, for example, here, we reduce the capital expense, and meaning that we don't need to procure an additional or newer generation of hardware and invest in the data center. We can free up space, right? Once we move the workload in the cloud, we do the cleanup, we adapt our backup and site recovery processes to accommodate the workload in the cloud, and we get a little bit more hard drive space and CPU memory back to our environment, right? Which means more imminent investment in the from the cloud, right? Now, again, after a while, specific analysis can be made, so it can be a very measurable return of investment process, but it is a thing. Refactoring means that if I can amend the virtual or physical machine and map it directly to a cloud service, like a web application service, right? If it's a website, go for platform, go for the web service in the Azure. Reduce operational management costs, it's faster, maybe a minor change in some of the application components, bada bing, bada boom, it runs. Mix of infrastructure or move and improve workloads and platform services, it's possible. Done a couple of projects like that. So a website of some kind, I would say don't even think about it. Move it as a web application service, not as a virtual machine. You reduce the footprint, you reduce the management, and improve the operations, right? The most complex processes would be re-architect, or kind of a worst case scenario, rebuild or new, right? The architecture model, that's so if the first two would be adopt, this would be innovate more, right? Means that simply the workload we are trying to move does not understand the cloud. Is it a legacy? Is it bound to a specific process inside, right? Is it a monolithic type, right? The guys with the monolithic process, they had to re-architect everything. All the 200 applications are re-architect. They run 5 Kubernetes environment to accommodate the five environments. So they have 200 applications. Each application has 5 Kubernetes environments where it runs. It's more than 1,000 resource groups in the Azure. So it's crowded there, but that's enterprise environment, right? The rebuild renew takes us very far back into the architecture and design. We start from scratch actually at this point, right? We throw everything we have on premises. We create the new operational cloud adoption model, right? And then it just booms. But then again, we have to have a sign off from the business. It will take some time. It will take resources, time, and initial investment in the process. But once we get there, we would be a kind of a natively cloud ready. Now, the stage 4 for, let's say, startups, that's new, right? So they start with the cloud. That's easy. But when you have legacy in on-premises in the data center, then you need to think one of these 4 to be used. Now, I mentioned the organizational alignment, right? As I speak, you probably have this picture here. I have the cloud adoption, I have the cloud on the other side, right? Looks fairly easy, right? But we need to keep in line everything, right, here. So out of the alignment model, so we have alignment towards the current organizational chart, and then assigning specific responsibilities, and then we keep our current control and management infrastructure. Doesn't work for everybody. We have also the option of virtual teaming, right? I pull subject matter experts or knowledge from different segments, create those virtual teams. They do not change or depart from the current organizational alignment, but they're part of the cloud adoption teams or team, right? And last but not least is the mixed model, right? Because it will take some time. Organizational transformation process is a long process. I was working for Microsoft. I went through 3 different organizational alignment processes. Big companies tend to do that a lot. Either way, the model is based on RACI matrix, right? Responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. It's not something that Microsoft invented. It's part of the project management things and organizational alignments, right? Right, we need to identify a responsible person for a specific type of workload in the cloud adoption team. Right? They have to be accountable for what they're doing. They're subject matter experts for that specific responsibility they carry, right? So they need to be consulted and they need to be informed, right? Whether it's intra-team, is it between different cloud adoption teams, whether it's with the security governance, wherever, whether it's with the business, right? We need to know what's going on. Even if you're part of the core development team or the testing team or the data scientist teams, you need to be informed, right? Because that process will affect you. You're part of the line, right? Of the group of people that work with that. So cloud adoption and then move to the cloud for, right, demo test environments. Maybe, let's try this. Not a thing to consider, right? A lot of wrong things can happen later on in the cycle. Now, the maturity model actually addresses this to be the proper one, right? This is the minimum viable product model, right? We have the cloud adoption team and we have the cloud governance team, right? The cloud adoption teams is the team with technical solution professionals, the people that do business alignment, they do project management, they do operations for the solutions or the workloads we port as, in this case, the viable product inside the Azure. The cloud governance team, it's the other side of the balancing sheet, right? They ensure the excellence in the solutions that we have chosen and adopted. They look at the platform maturity processes, the platform operations, the governance itself, and any form of automation inside, right? Now, as we progress, right, as you know, the curve earlier, one of the things that we would get, there are extra steps in the maturity model, but this is what usually happens in most of the organization, right? We have the centralized IT team, right? We moved from a decentralized model, right, through the MVP process, which is not correlated to the MVP, Microsoft MVP status. This is minimum viable product. And then we create a centralized IT team, right? The organizational alignment shifts in that area. So we might have multiple cloud adoption teams running different applications, services, whatever the plan is there. The guys I mentioned for the 200 applications, they did had quite a few cloud adoption teams at the end. I mean, it took them some time to do things, but they actually did it. The only thing they lacked on the other side was the problem with the centralized IT operations. And any form of change control is managed by the central IT in this case. Now, there is a certain risk involved in the central IT team, which is something that we need to discuss additionally in this case, but yeah, there are implications, but the larger the organization is, the more complex structure we will have, because the processes behind are complex, right? So we might have the IT operations here, the automation or the DevOps, the IT security, then the IT governance teams would directly work with the governance teams. The cloud platform side team would be the IT administrators, right? And they would kind of touch upon each other based on the RACI matrix inside. Now, the ultimate goal here is to get to the so-called center of excellence. That's the highest level of maturity, but that's the most complex environment. Not many achieve that level. In the organizational alignment process, right? Well, in a nutshell, this is you guys. This is me and you, right? Well, maybe I'm already on the job market on the other side, but you will be here somewhere in this blue or green areas, right? This is, let's say, the IT staff members that are required to match this cloud adoption process based on the cloud adoption framework and the business and the technology side and the governance and risk and compliance, right? And as far as I heard this past few days, I can even name some people that can be here in this group, which means the certification process, and this is a certification that the URL, and I'll have it also at the end of the presentation, it can be shared. This is where you choose your career path, actually. What fits your bill from a cloud adopter team member, right? Cloud adoption team member from an IT perspective. Yeah, might take some time to get to the business, or you might get soon enough, but this is in a nutshell you guys here, all of us here in the call. Different roles, different capabilities, different learning tracks and paths, right? Now, and this is just the technical side, right? Now, I mentioned once we get to a certain point, right, especially in the readiness phase, we think of how we're going to land actually our workloads in the Azure, right? And from that standpoint, we're primarily talking on the landing zone concept. I'll just give you a kind of a small sample of what a landing zone looks like. And there is a big difference if we're talking about greenfield or so-called brownfield process. Greenfield means nothing is there, we start fresh. Best case scenario ever, which means we can design all these components based on a proper business analysis, planning, adoption process, then reiterate if necessary. When there are some workloads in the cloud, that would imply a brownfield, which means we need to look at what was set up already and try to work around that one. That's the toughest point you might get into a certain project. Especially if somebody did something, they stopped or got stuck, or something, for some reasons, the process stopped and then they moved further. Now, this just gives you a kind of a sample of what a landing zone would be. If I look at the overall picture, this is the end-to-end enterprise landing zone concept. Now, Cloud Adoption Framework just explains what is what, and you'll find your way around it eventually, right? But the idea here is, as far as the common approach goes, right, we look at certain aspects, right, like billing, the environment, the identity and access management, what's the network topology and connectivity, how do I organize the resources, what governance management and security, or short it's, well, it's GRC, governance risk compliance, but what are the governance management and security model, and what's the platform automation and or DevOps in this case process. Now, we check all the boxes that are relevant for our solution. If we figure out we need, so we can start with a couple of these, not necessarily everything, and then we check additional box and then iterate, and then we go round and round until, right, every small implementation we do checks, lessons learned, best practices, so we implement in the next iteration, and next until we get to the big picture here, eventually one day. Now again, each one of you might be a different part of this environment, but at a certain point you will be part of something like this. Now, last but not least, before I wrap up the kind of a high-level overview of the cloud adoption framework, we can talk a lot about different aspects, but probably will take me a week. The governance methodology, right? It is bound to a specific set of corporate policies and compliance, external or external in a form, right? It can be something internally decided, but it can be based, as I mentioned before, whether we are in the so-called regulated vertical, like finance or banking in general, government, etc. And how do we operate with that environment? Right. Business risk, policies compliance, processes. So in regards to cost management and specifically cost optimization, which is becoming a kind of a larger discipline now, but it's not a, let's say, an exact science, if I may use the term. I cannot tell you now, yeah, you can conserve money here. You need to analyze that. And the analysis for example, cost management, funny enough, it's also not only used to optimize the operational cost, but also to make sure that from an IT operations side, there are no issues. Right, a sudden burst of utilization of a service might mean that the code deployed 2 hours earlier is buggy, right? Which means as the cost goes up, there will be alerting mechanisms. So not only the finance and the business people would be, ooh, we spent too much money, but it can also come back to the IT operations, right? Saying, well, we did this 2 hours ago and we have significant spike in over provisioning of the service or over utilization. So what's the reason for that? And vice versa. The IT operational knowledge can also go back to the security guys. So there is an attack on the service, which means for some reasons it's either choking, right? Which means that's the RATSI matrix here, right? Informed properly. There is also the security baselines, the resource consistency and the way how they're deployed and in regards to the policy and compliance requirements goes hand in hand with identity. And last but not least, on the processes and automation, standardization of any deployment process. If a workload type 1 has services A, B, C, D, E, F inside, I structured that in a template and I have or automation process. And if it runs once successfully, it will run 1 million times, unless I do two things: change something in the template or in the services that are provisioned by the template, or something on the service side changes. That means I need to retest it. If it runs again successfully, the next million times. On the management side, right, we move to an environment we do not specifically control. Yes, we have different tools and capabilities that will give us the knowledge of what's going on. They will give us the alerting, the automation processes. Some workflows can kick in regards to releasing the burden of the operational teams. But we need to do what's going on over there, right? The team needs to know how to respond. We need to test the processes. We need to make sure that even if there is some form of an outage, we know what our automation or manual remediation processes are. It can be as simple as keeping a person that knows the manual process in each shift in the operations team, right? So if you operate in 3 shifts, there should be always at least one person that knows how things are mitigated in a manual way, whether it's a service failure or backup process or disaster recovery process. It can be as simple as that. And then the feedback here, right? Any costs or security or performance-related issue needs to be also analyzed by the teams. So we make sure that it's not process-related, service-related, or external-related in that aspect. Last but not least would be the security, right? Again, access control, who has access to what and what they can do in the environment. Can I modify certain configurations? Could I deploy something? And this is based on the security operations. Some people refer also to dev security ops, but for me, there is no need to put security in the DevOps. It is embedded as a process inside, right? Managing the application and service keys, the certificates, things like that, there are corresponding services that can do that. The thing I have is what visibility I have on the issues. How do I protect them as part of the process of the as the methodology goes, and what's my response process? Do I automate? Do I do it manually? Right? And again, when you think of data center, that's static technology. When you think about cloud, that's dynamic environment. That's like tornado. It just sucks us in and spins us around with different things, right? So the learning curve is steep, right? We need to know things, and things change and tend to change a lot. But that's the way how we run things these days, and we adapt, right? These are the options we have from that standpoint. Now, again, fairly short, but I hope it was effective. These are some of the amended links, which I added also the Microsoft Learn as a repository in regards to the skills, sessions, attending events like this, or other community group events and things that happen a lot. So I have a bunch of links I can share on that topic, because there is a lot of thing going on in the different communities around the world, and this virtual model enable to connect it. The problem is we have only 24 hours per day for everything. Yeah, I'll share the presentation so you can actually benefit also from the links and get some additional information. That would be all from my side.